Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back once again to the Strange Playgrounds podcast, episode 3. Episode 3. I'm massively enjoying this, I've got to say, and I am so very happy that people seem to be enjoying it and are requesting more of it. So thank you so much to everyone who listens, who enjoys, who comments, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much. I will endeavour to make the space that I demand in your head an interesting one, if not a beautiful one. We shall see how it pans out, shall we? It will be in reference to my own particular standards of beauty, which are very Clive Barkerian and sort of H.R. Giger-ish and very weird, as you'd expect. Anywho, this time around, I have a sort of inkling to talk about. There are so many subjects. There are so many subjects that have been working on my mind, that have been playing on my attention recently. When I was a young man, my very first computer, my very first video game system was a Commodore Amiga, it's a computer that's very fondly remembered in the UK and throughout Europe, but is largely forgotten in the US, although it did have some US market presence. It's infamous in the UK for being the precursor to home computing. It was one of the very first marginally affordable home computer systems that did stuff like word processing and paint systems, as well as video games. It was at the time a very advanced video game system, although it seems horrendously clunky by today's standards. Oh my god. And even by the standards of a half a decade after its release, it seemed very clunky indeed. But what I've been doing recently is revisiting a lot of the games that I used to play back then, which were my first experiences of video games, and many of which had a horror bent to them. I mean, this was rare back then. This was rare back in the 1980s, sort of late 1980s, early 1990s. Video games were still largely regarded as a children's medium. They were regarded as toys, as things that children played, although adults obviously did play them, but were kind of it was a kind of a shameful thing to do. It was a little bit like collecting children's toys and so on and so forth. Obviously adults played them because the market became increasingly geared towards adults as the medium evolved. But the Amiga was slightly different. It was a bit different from the more standard video game consoles of the time, the things like the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, in that it did have a certain adult base to it, and it wasn't so constrained by market forces in terms of what subject matter it could deal with. So there were horror video games on it. There were explicitly horror video games, and although they were, I mean, immensely crude by today's standards, they were shocking at the time. We had things like, for example, Alien Breed by Team 17, which, although despite being a complete Aliens knockoff and being not only terribly derivative but massively crude by current standards, it was horrific at the time because we had very little to compare it with. We had things like Darkseid. Darkseid is notable for being an adventure game, a sort of point-and-click adventure game, very much in the vein of Monkey Island and that kind of thing, but rather than being cartoonish and comedy, it was actually a science fiction horror piece that used the work of H.R. Giger as its inspiration very effectively. Interesting game, not one I'd recommend playing now because it's almost impossible to play, but worth having a look at, definitely worth having a look at. And it's interesting to me. I'm perpetually fascinated by influence, by the experiences and the input that shapes the nature of our imaginations. I am perpetually fascinated by that. And by that which influenced my own imagination, my own output. But since it is something of a sacred artifact to me, a sacred article, that was my cat, by the way. That was Rufus, if you heard her mewling there. Bugger off, Rufus. Apologies, ladies and gents. But, yes. I've lost my train of thought. I am perpetually fascinated by input, by influence, by those circumstances and factors that shape the natures of our imaginations. It seems to me, although it's very difficult to say one way or the other, because I can't sort of get inside your heads and assess the shape of your imaginations unless you open it up to me somehow, as writers and artists and creators in general do. But it seems to me that each imagination is its own phenomena, owing to the unique influences that shaped it, and therefore, due to it, the unique nature of it. Every single imagination or consciousness is a separate thing. It's a species unto itself, and therefore the input that it comes out with is unique and interesting, and indeed a species unto itself. One thing we cannot do, I mean, one thing we can never have any kind, even the delusion of objectivity upon, is the nature of our own minds and the state of our own imaginations, because they are ours. They are inextricable from what we are and what we presume, and the whatever delusion of a reality that we operate in. Totally inextricable. But that, I find the exercise of assessment, of sort of self-autopsy, really fascinating, and an entirely worthwhile one, even though there will never be any kind of end product to it. It's a perpetual process. It's something that there will never be a product on. It allows for a degree of self-autopsy, of assessing how one responds and how one's state of mind occurs and whatnot. It really is a fascinating exercise, and it's something I explore a lot in my own writing because it is something that fascinates me so much. But those video games, those early video games, are so, the images and the sounds and the sensations of them are so entrenched in my state of imagination that they recur. There are certain images and concepts that recur again. Darkseid is a very good example of that, which of course led me on, alongside input such as the film Alien, which is also partially inspired by Giger's work and indeed incorporates the man's work in its design. It led me onto H.R. Giger's artwork, and if there was ever an artist that could capture what's inside my head most consistently, it would probably be H.R. Giger. I mean, his work is such a raking of the subconscious. It throws up images and melds them all together. So you have Freudian intermingling with the Jungian. You've got the mechanical with the biological, the technological with the spiritual, and the base and the sort of uterinal almost with the metaphysical. It's so weird. It's brilliant. It is absolutely stunning. I love H.R. Giger's work. If I ever need inspiration, or if I want to feel something, even if it is a state of disturbance or unsettlement or something negative, then I go and look at my artwork collections of H.R. Giger, which I have on my shelves over there, or I look at the work of Hieronymus Bosch or Goya, or any artist whose work really unsettles me. And I mean, this leads on to a wider point in many respects, which is something I'll explore more fully in a later podcast, but the notion that this is what art or created things should do. I personally don't care how a piece of work makes me feel, as long as it makes me feel something. I will go for the piece of work that makes me feel execrable, that makes me feel despair and depression and misanthropy, above and beyond the plastic, fantastic, frictionless piece of work that makes me feel nothing, or that just makes me feel sort of momentary thrills and sort of shocks at particular images or action set pieces. I will go for the despairing piece. I will go for the ugly. I will go for the fury evoking over and beyond that, quite happily, quite happily, because that's what all created things should do. They should make you feel something. And something that does really bother me about sort of postmodern markets, if you like, about media as it stands on a popular level, is that we don't go for that. And we generally, on a culture-wide level, not only do we not go for that, we don't get it. We're not given that because the creators, or rather the people who hold the money, the studios, the distributors, and so on and so forth, they're afraid of alienating us, or they're afraid of alienating particular demographics, and as a result, you get the most diluted work imaginable, something that is decided and written by committee, that is edited by test audience. So you get something that's anodyne, that's comforting. I hate comforting work. I hate it. I hate it. I absolutely loathe work that comforts and that cossets and that reinforces us in our assumptions. I hate it. I absolutely loathe it. I don't want it. I do not want work that reinforces social narratives or that extols the virtue of the meta-narratives that underpin culture and society and the way things work, that extol the virtues of tradition. I don't want it. I do not want it. I want something that I can get up from. If I go to the cinema, I want to sit down and have something that will shift my state of mind and will stay with me, that will resonate long after I've got up and left the theatre, that I will be thinking about for days, maybe even weeks or months after, that will change me in some way, that will maybe throw into question something that I assume or something that is sacred to me. I really like that. I like that feeling. And it goes to the power of N for horror works. Horror works on that basis. If it doesn't, if it does not in some way unsettle you or distress you or disturb you or offend you, then there's no point in its existence. It's an impotent thing, and calling it horror is meaningless because it isn't. It is something that masquerades as horror, that is marketed as horror for the reason of marketing itself, because those are the beats that it hits. That's the pattern that it conforms to. If it's familiar, if it is something that reinforces what we know of that genre, then it is not. It is not. It cannot be described as such. Horror, in order to legitimize its own status as such, has to upset us. It has to disturb us. It has to make audiences feel uncomfortable. If it doesn't, then it's not. It's not, which is why I really loathe sort of certain codified forms of horror and the way markets shake out at the moment. We have this real problem at the moment, and it occurs in independent horror as well. Even though independent horror has more space for creativity and for novelty, you get these hideous sub-categorizations of horror. You've got bizarro, and you've got splatterpunk, and you get zombie apocalypse fiction, and so on and so forth. And the problem with that is they become sub-markets. They become cultures in and of themselves. Something hideous coalesces around the core of those assumptions, of those traditions, if you like. And the more they coalesce, the more they amass weight and significance, the more crystallized they become, and the more conservative they become. The more the audiences that are attracted to that kind of fiction will go for something that is labelled as bizarro, as splatterpunk, as whatever, rather than stretching their wings a bit, rather than allowing themselves to go out and experience something that they probably wouldn't, or that something that is outside those boundaries. And the reason for that is, no matter how potentially extreme the subject matter, or how ostensibly grotesque or graphic, it actually isn't. It's actually comforting because, again, we're following familiar patterns, things that the audience know. And that is a very dangerous trap to fall into. It's something that a lot of horror writers and a lot of horror cinema does fall into, though. It's something that has absolutely murdered a lot of very promising franchises. I mean, one of my favourites, Hellraiser, is a fantastic example of that. Now, ostensibly, the imagery and the subject matter in all the Hellraiser films is quite extreme, it's quite graphic, but it is not, after the first two films anyway, it is not distressing, it is not disturbing. It is, in fact, in a very strange way, kind of comforting to the audiences that go for them, because we know what to expect. We know that someone somewhere is going to stumble across the box and they're going to open it either by accident or intentionally, and the flesh hooks are going to start flying, and there's going to be some graphic scene of pain and bodily mutilation, and the Cenobites are going to turn up, and blah, 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 blah. It's actually comforting. it's not, it's cosseting. It's a bit like going for it's like going to a restaurant and always ordering the meal that you know because you know you like it, rather than challenging your palate and going for something a little bit more interesting. It also has this effect whereby when somebody enters those arenas and tries to shake them up a little bit, when they do something a bit interesting with the format, the audiences react in a negative way, because they don't like being challenged. They like what they like, and that's a real problem, especially for those of us who really do try to push the boundaries, who really do try to give audiences something that is outside, it's off kilter, it's outside of what they know, it defies a degree of categorization. It's very difficult to do that and be sort of financially successful, to gain a degree of market share, which is why I have such respect. I have such respect for the likes of Clive Barker and Poppy Z. Brite, aka Billy Martin, two writers who I adore. I absolutely adore, and who do this, who actually enter into familiar genres and shake them up a little bit, or rather did in their heyday, whilst they were still writing work, you know. Clive Barker, although he is ostensibly still writing, hasn't written anything good for a long time. And Billy Martin, who was once known as Poppy Z. Brite, doesn't write so much anymore. There are one or two bits and pieces of short fiction. Billy is actually working on a bits of non-fiction at the moment, and I'll put links down below. What Billy is currently working on is it's this really interesting examination of metaphysics in Stephen King called Water Where God Wills It. It's really fascinating, because it's something that chimes with my interest in King's work. I like it when King goes off the beaten track. I like it when he does weird. I like it when he does the really inventive, strange, metaphysical stuff, because he's actually really good at it. The odd thing is, he doesn't have much confidence in it. If you read On Writing, he actually, and some of his other interview books, he talks about this. He talks about why he doesn't often go like to the degrees and the extremes of metaphysics that, say, Clive Barker does. And the reason is that he doesn't have much confidence in his own ability in that regard, in the sort of florid, fantastical imagery, the highfalutin ideas that he plays with. And that's really interesting to me, because when he does do it, like in The Dark Tower, for example, like in Talisman, like in what's another example, possibly the Regulators, he's actually pretty damn good at it. He is pretty damn good when he lets himself go, when he lets himself fly. Whether his standard readers, whether his established audience, the ones who fell in love with him for his work in the 1980s, you know, which has now become so enshrined in horror, it's practically cliche, things like Carrie and The Shining, and, you know, the stuff that is endlessly parodied, that when you see a parody of it in The Simpsons or in Family Guy or whatever, you know exactly what it is, even if you've never read the fucking books or never seen the fucking films. I think that stuff is really interesting. And even when he doesn't quite hit the mark, I appreciate the effort. And I find it fascinating that Billy is actually looking at this stuff. But in a roundabout way, that brings me to what I was going to talk about in this podcast, despite rabbiting on for 20-odd minutes about something completely different. I really wanted to talk about the work of Billy Martin, who used to be known as Poppy Z. Brite. Billy's work is one of those bodies of work that when I found it, it was like black lightning out of a clear sky. I found Billy almost by accident. It's a weird thing. I found him almost by accident. I found him whilst I was at university, whilst I was in the midst of a very, very dark and crippling state of depression and social anxiety that I didn't know I had. That's the interesting thing. I didn't know I had it. I wasn't diagnosed until way later on, by which time I'd started to come out of it. So that was a lot of use. You know, I didn't know I had it. It just seemed normal to me. But I was in that state, and the one thing that helped me so much at that time was literature. And it always has, I've always had a book. Ever since I was a very young child, I've always had a book on the go. I've always had a book or more with me, always. I used to carry them around like comfort blankets before I got my phone with my Kindle on it. Now I can carry around like the Library of Alexandria in my pocket. I don't carry books around anymore because I can put up whatever one I want on my Kindle and read whatever the fuck I like. But I used to carry them around in bags and whatnot. I always used to be that strange, odd, shifty-looking guy on the bus who used to radiate this "stay the fuck away from me" aura, reading some big, thick horror tome or some big, thick fantasy book or something like that. And it helped me a great deal. It's one of the times I really started to fall in love with this literature all over again after my initial exposure as a child, when I started to find new degrees of it, new facets, new interpretations based upon these evolving contexts. But the books helped me an enormous amount. They kept me alive, they kept me sane. I don't know what I would have done without them. It's as simple as that. And what I found was, during that period, I was aching. I was like parched for something new. I wanted something. I read so many horror collections back then, and I was bored with all of them because I'd read so much. I devoured so much. I was so bored with it all. I was so bored of stories about possession. I was so bored about stories about haunted fucking houses, about exorcisms, about demons and serial killers and all of that shit. I was so fucking bored with it. What I wanted was something like Clive Barker's stuff, but something that was new, something that was as affecting to me, but new, something I hadn't read before. And I was absolutely starving for it. And I came home one summer from university, and I was wandering around. A friend of mine, my friend Graham, and I were wandering around this fantastic bookstore. You wouldn't even know it's there. It's like this big warehouse that's been converted into a bookstore. And it's everything I want from a bookstore. Nothing is in its place. Everything is everywhere. There's just piles of shit and books and boxes of books that have no categorization. Everything's on the wrong shelves. There's no order to it. There's dust everywhere. The shelves are sort of sagging under the weight of books that are on them. It's absolutely wonderful. And the old guy that runs it sits behind his desk and smokes and just enjoys life, enjoys living. The upstairs of that place was perpetually freezing. It was always so fucking cold that even in the height of summer they had electric radiators on and lanterns on because you couldn't see, it was so dark. In the winter, frost and ice formed in there. It was the best place ever. And it was upstairs. While I was wandering around upstairs and being terribly amused by a cat that used to live up there and used to sort of prowl across the shelves and knock all the stock off, that I saw this book, this big hardback book, just amidst all of the others that just sang to me. You know when that happens, when you love books and you're in a bookstore and you just see a spine or a cover or something and it sings to you? Well, that's what happened. I saw this big hardback book that had written up the spine in big, luridly pink letters, Poppy Z Brite. And I'll be honest, it was the name that drew me first. It was the name. I just saw the name and I immediately, instinctively went and picked that book off the shelf. And it was a book entitled Self-Made Man. Self-Made Man, a short story collection. And I read the first short story right there and then, because it was very short. I can't remember what it was called, but it was a short story from the perspective of a maggot that was eating its way through the mind of a dead scholar, a dead philosopher, and as it was eating him, it was absorbing his knowledge and sort of swelling with it, but not in any kind of not for any particular purpose. It didn't have any pretensions of swelling beyond its state of becoming anything else other than a maggot. It was actually a kind of despairing commentary that this meat that was so saturated with knowledge and with learning and with experience was just meat for the maggot. That's kind of the point of the story. And it was beautiful. It was one of those stories that left me slightly breathless. The prose is kind of jagged and poetic and sensual in a way that I adore in literature. If you want to get me, if you want to snare me, if a book wants to snare me, then it has to go for the intimate. I don't do God's eye view very well. I don't write it very well. I've tried it, and I don't read it very well. I don't like it. I like intimate sensory detail. I like to see things and experience things from the perspectives of characters. It's why I like Patrick Suskind so much. It's why I like books like Perfume. It's why I absolutely adore the likes of Clive Barker, because he does it very, very well. But what I found reading this short story collection, and I went back, I took it along with a load of others that were there by Poppy Z. Brite, and they were very cheap. Like, this was a big hardback book, and it was like £2.50 or something ridiculous like that, so a bargain. I took them back, and we went and sat in Graham's back garden drinking cider, I believe, and I read half of this book. Just sat out there, and the short stories, the prose just got me immediately. It has this real sort of youthful exuberance about it, but also this perversity, this incredible perversity, this love of the sensual, where you get scents and smells and textures, where the sense of place is amazing. I mean, the one thing that Billy is very good at doing is evoking place through, not through descriptions of the place, but through senses of the place, smells in particular. When a story of his is set in New Orleans, you can smell it. You can smell that city, for good or ill, or anywhere for that matter. You can smell it. There's as a result of that experience, I loved it because it's perverse, because it's not just horror. It's not horror that's about horror. It's not about... Often, the horror in Billy's work is not about grossing you out. It's not... Although that element is definitely there. Bloody hell, is it graphic. It's not the point of it, though. There's a joy and a poetry and an exuberance here. When there's graphic mutilation in one of Billy Martin, a.k.a. Poppy Z. Brite's books or short stories, it's beautiful. It is absolutely exquisite, and is often, in a very distressing vein, also often erotic. It makes you... There's a heavy erotic element to Billy Martin's work, and it goes for the gusto. It wants you to feel. It's exactly what I was talking about earlier. It wants you to feel. It wants you to taste the food. It wants you to feel the knife. It wants you to have the fucking orgasm while you're reading it. It wants you to be able to taste and feel and see what's going on. It wants you to taste the blood and the sperm and the whatever, the sweat and the flesh. It's absolutely wonderful, and you do, because the prose is so vivid. You do, and as a result of that experience, I went out and bought pretty much everything that Billy had ever published, ever published. The next thing I read was Exquisite Corpse, which is Billy's novel, which is about two serial killers, one of whom is operating in the 1980s gay scene of London, the other of which is operating in the 1980s gay scene in New Orleans. And it's about how they sort of find one another. They come together through a series of circumstances that somehow... It simultaneously feels like fate, but also just feels like random chance. And they recognize one another, and they have this union, this communion that is violent and sadistic and erotic and insanely hot. It is unbelievably hot, especially if you're a gay man. I mean, bloody hell. Billy's work really does talk to gay men on our level. It really does. It appeals to gay men because it is very legitimately the voice of a gay man. So the experiences within, although not universally, there are plenty of straight characters too, but Billy Billy often utilizes gay characters and often talks about the experience of being gay in a very lurid and very warts and all way, which I absolutely appreciate. I absolutely love. Exquisite Corpse has got all of it. It has commentaries upon the AIDS epidemic. It has this rainbow, this absolute rainbow of characters, all of whom are absolutely beautiful, and you so black and dark and violent, and it has so much dirt and filth and sex and just wonder to it. Absolute wonder. You know, I stopped reading that book in public. I got something else that I could take out in public. The reason being, it's so fucking lurid and so erotic that it makes it so you don't want to be reading it in public. Let's just put it that way. Billy, if you're listening to this, here's one of the best recommendations for that book I could possibly imagine. I lent it to a friend of mine who's straight, and he read it and he came back to me and he said, that was one of the hottest things I've ever read. That, I could go for that. I'm totally fucking straight, but I could go for that. I mean, that's just it. That is just wonderful. But the fact that you have this intermingling of LGBTQ characters and themes and subjects and horror material, but also domestic stuff. You also have domestic dramas and work that is more science fiction. It's absolutely stunning. And also these wonderful, and I mean absolutely wonderful little slice of life domestic dramas that are nothing, that go nowhere, that have no plots at all, but are absolutely beautiful. You'll find most of those in Antediluvian Tales, by the way, which is I think Billy's last short story collection, if memory serves. Most of the stories in that collection are not stories at all. They're just these little snapshots, these little slices of life where people are doing nothing. They're just going to a restaurant for something to eat. They're just walking down a street. They're just going to their jobs. That's it. And it's gorgeous. It's absolutely exquisite. But at the time, I had not read much fiction at the time that spoke to me as a gay man. I really hadn't. And, that was another area where I felt fairly alienated because I don't like gay bars. I didn't like the gay scene where I was at university. So trying to find like other gay men to connect with, and I don't mean in a sexual way, although that too, to explore who I was as a gay man was difficult. So I did a lot of it through literature. And Billy's work really helped in that regard. I mean, it was like an outlet. It was like and it explores this stuff in the most extreme and lurid way, but it allows you, it speaks to us. It speaks to us on a very, very, very intimate level because it's honest. It's honest about everything. It's honest about it's not just, it is not just about some political screed or some socio-cultural screed about gay rights, although that is in there in a very subtle manner. It's about the experience of being LGBTQ, and it works. It speaks to us. It evokes things, and that was novel to me. Although Barker is a gay man too. Barker doesn't often write about the experience of being gay in his work. There are very few examples of Barker's work that even include gay characters. Imagica has two. Sacrament obviously is about being gay, but that's the only one, and I'd read that by that point. There are not many, whereas Billy's generally does, because it's aimed at us. It's designed to talk to us, and to have a writer who writes about something I know, something I know very intimately, the experience of being LGBTQ and the horror stuff that I adore, and which does it in a way I love, which is not finger-wagging and judgmental, but which just gives you the portrait. Not only that, but which explores the horror elements in the same way. In Exquisite Corpse, there's no judgment upon Andrew Compton or Jay, what's-his-face, the other one. You know why I forget his second name? Because I find the English one more attractive. That's what it is. Andrew Compton, the English serial killer, is fucking hot. He just is. I mean, I've lent that work to a lot of my gay friends, and they all come back with the same thing. I would let Andrew fucking eat me. I would let Andrew fucking kill me while he fucked me, because he is so attractive. That character is so attractively written, but there's no judgment. Despite the fact that these two people are the worst people imaginable. They're hideous. They're evil fucking personified. They are true psychopaths. They are malevolent, sadistic, cruel, but you like them. By the end of the book, despite the fact that they murder horrendously characters that you like, I mean, there's a bit towards the end of the book where the most innocent character comes into their company and it's horrendous. It's horrendous. You still like them. By the end, you still want these guys to get away with it. And that's amazing. That's amazing to me, that this book can make you sympathise with these characters. Billy's breakout work, the work that is most often associated with his name, or rather with the name of Poppy Z. Brite, Lost Souls, is a vampire book. And now, usually, what I would do is look at a vampire book and go, it's a fucking vampire book. They're boring. They're fucking dull. I've had enough of them. Lost Souls does it in a very different way. What I love about Lost Souls is that it does what Lost Boys does for film. It's one of the very few works that actually explores the sheer joyous, youthful abandon and exuberance of being a vampire, of being immortal. These creatures in this book, they are just atavistic, visceral creatures that love what they are and love what they do and have no parameters whatsoever. Their sexuality, their appetites, their joy, the drugs, everything. They indulge, and it's joyous. It's absolutely wonderful. It goes for it. It really goes for it. It's not about the horror of being a monster. It's about the joy of being a monster, and that speaks to me. That speaks to me on such a fundamental level, because that's what I like. That's what I like. By and large, I don't want to know about how horrendous this is. I don't want to see characters running away from the monsters, or rather, not for long. I want to know, I want to see what it's like to be the monster, and I want to know why it's attractive, why we keep coming back to it. And it is. We know it is. We know it is because of Hellraiser. You know, the popularity of Hellraiser isn't due to the horror of the Cenobites. It's not. It's because there's a part of us that wants to know what it's like. They promise pleasure. They promise a state of being beyond the notions of pain or pleasure. And we want to know. We want to know. You know what? If I had that puzzle box, if I had the lament configuration, I would open it. I am that guy. I want to know. Not only that, it promises transcendence beyond the pain, beyond the extremity, beyond the insanity. It promises transcendence. We know this. We know this because we've seen it happen. To exist as a Cenobite, to exist as a vampire, to exist as a werewolf, to exist as something beyond human that operates in other contexts. There is a joyousness to that. And that's what attracts me. That's what interests me. There are some works and franchises that can sustain on the horror of it. Things like The Thing, for example, like Alien, I think sustain on that basis. But I want to know, I want to see things from the monster's perspective. I want to know what it feels like. I want to know what it feels like splitting out of your skin. I want to know what it feels like being this other entity and of being outside the species you were born to. Especially for someone like me who has very little love for it, who defines as a misanthrope, you know, has very little love for humanity as a phenomenon. I think that's what's attractive about it. Certainly what attracts me about Billy Martin's work, the short story collections, the novels, but also there's a series that Billy writes, which I adore on an entirely other level. I adore on an entirely other level because it's entirely different from everything else he's ever written. It's the Liquor series. The Liquor series is this series of novels and short stories that are kitchen sink dramas. They are kitchen sink dramas with no supernatural elements whatsoever. Some of the supernatural characters sometimes pass through that reality, but they don't ever bring their weirdness with them. It's just this series about two young guys who realize that they're gay in high school, who fall in love, and who have many travails and trials with their families and with their circumstances, and end up opening a restaurant called Liquor, whose gimmick is that every dish has some form of liquor in it. And it's just about how they live, it's just about how they operate, and they are such attractive characters, despite being really flawed and really problematic and having lots of problems. They are really interesting, wonderful, attractive characters, and I like being in their company. It's something that I think gay men need. We need fiction, and we need media that talks to us about our experience, or about what that experience could be, because we are starved for it. We are starved for it, despite the efflorescence in recent years of media that will allow us to explore this. There are still those forces within society that react to even the acknowledgement of there being LGBTQ characters, of going too far, of having an agenda. Yeah, the agenda is we just want what you have. We want to be spoken to. We want to be acknowledged. That's all. I think it's very important for our state of minds for that media to exist, and it's something that bothers me about young gay people, particularly young gay men who are in high school now, who don't really have it, or even if they do have it, it's shit. It's stuff that's prescribed by predominantly straight culture and predominantly by tradition. Particularly horror and sci-fi and what would be called speculative fiction fans, because those areas, there is still gatekeeping, there is still a protectionism, despite the fact that they are so florid, and those genres are probably some of the very best to use to speak to the experience of being LGBTQ, of being non-standard, of being non-binary. I'm actually reading at the moment this independent short story collection of stories about the experience of being trans, called Brave Boy World, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It's brilliant in the same way that Billy Martin's fiction is brilliant, because by and large they are not political tracts, they are not socio-cultural commentaries. What these stories do is use science fiction concepts to remove the conversation from those prescriptions. The problem with those conversations, and it's a problem we have in general, is that they operate within the prescriptions of culture. They operate within the parameters that are often defined by those who fancy themselves our enemies. So we are constantly trying to justify ourselves on a cultural and political level. This book, just like Billy Martin's work, removes the conversation from those parameters and blasts it wide. It brings into question the very notion of what sex and gender are, and the legitimacy of how we define by it in worlds, in states where those concepts are fluid, are very, very fluid indeed, where they even become, there are even stories in those collections where they become, who cares, where they become matters of incidence. It doesn't matter. You know, there are instances in Brave Boy World where characters wake up female one morning and go, oh, right, okay, that's that then, fine. Then a few days later wake up male. And it's sort of like, oh, fine, whatever. It's really fascinating. It's a really fascinating arena to play in. And this is something I love. I love in all forms of fiction, but I particularly like it when horror fiction does it, because horror speaks to me. Horror is... It's my bread and butter. It's what I was raised on. It's what is in my head. It's what my own imagination vomits out. And if you read, I mean, not to get too self-promotional about it, but if you read my short story collections, if you read Strange Playgrounds, if you read Born in Blood, if you read the one that's coming out relatively soon, Essential Atrocities, then you'll see the influence. You'll see it. You will see the influence of these writers, because it's there. And Billy's work is one of those bodies that has had probably one of the most profound effects upon me, both as a lover of horror, a writer of horror, but also as a gay guy. It's just wonderful. I mean, if even I don't want to be exclusive about this, Go and read it regardless of how you define, because it's worth it, because it is such good fiction. What would I recommend first? Go for the short story collections first. Go for Self-Made Man. Go for Antediluvian Tales. They will sort of give you a taste and a flavour for these things, but also seek out some of the more obscure stuff. Go for triads. Have a look. Oh, definitely go for Exquisite Corpse. Exquisite Corpse is one of those books I read and reread every single year, because it's brilliant and intimidating and scintillating all at once. It's everything I want. It's everything I want. It's dark, it's misanthropic, it's moribund, but it's erotic and it's life-affirming and it's sensual. It's everything I want from this kind of work. It's absolutely beautiful. So I think I've rabbited on quite enough about all of this stuff. Thank you so much again for listening. And Billy, if you are out there, if you are listening to this, thank you so much for everything, basically, for your work, for what you've done for me. It's enormously appreciated. It's enormously appreciated. And thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. Next up, I think next up I'm gonna have a chat about some of the subgenres that I spoke about. I'm gonna have a chat about body horror next time. Body horror, Cronenberg, The Thing, H.R. Giger, all that stuff. I'll have a chat about that next time. Okie dokie. Thank you so much, ladies and gents, and until next time, bye bye.